there are a lot of really boring ways that you could tell an interesting story, and there are a lot of really interesting ways that you could tell a really boring story, and then it like suddenly becomes, like really cool depending on how you frame it.
Hi, and welcome back to StudioBinder Academy. I'm Brandon. Today we're speaking with editor Camille Getz, who's worked on music videos for Justin Bieber and documentaries like Ice Cold and Linda Perry Let It Die Here. Camille, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, to start off with, we always like to get everyone's background. Could you tell us what drew you to the film industry?
I think the first instance of me watching a movie and realizing that somebody had made it, like that it needs to be made by somebody and not that they just sort of like exist on their own, was Monsters, Inc. When I saw Monsters, Inc. as a kid. Kind of like, the movie was amazing, and then it also just at the same time occurred to me for whatever reason that like, oh, it's animated. Like, those aren't real, And something about that, like, it set me off on this path for like, I mean, I was, 7 or whatever when it came out, but for a while I thought that I wanted to do computer animation because I was like, holy shit. I think it all started with me realizing that Monsters, Inc. was not like a documentary, like that's something.
And was there anything that kind of drew you to editing specifically?
When I did my first video production camp as a kid, when I was like, Mom and Dad, I want to be a computer animation artist, and they were like, okay, but we're going to send you to video production camp because we don't know what that means. And it was just regular like DV camp, that like every kid goes to, I feel like. But you go through the whole process, some small scale version of everything. You shoot it, direct your little project, you write it, whatever. And then at the end, when we were editing our projects, it was very like, whoa, like everything else had been fun, but that really made sense to me in a way that the other stuff just had not. It just felt so easy, and I wanted to do it like all day. I was suddenly asking if I could edit everybody else's projects, It's so much fun. Like, can I just do yours? You don't want to do yours, right? Like, let me do it. It hadn't occurred to me until then that was like really a thing that you did, and it is. So, as it would turn out.
And do you have any specific films or specific editors that are kind of inspirations for you?
I mean, of course. Growing up, I always heard about Thelma Schoonmaker, but she's Martin Scorsese's editor. And she's like the editor, and the fact that she was a woman on top of that, and what I quickly grew to understand was like a pretty male-dominated field. Was always really cool to me. Beyond that, I mean, growing up, I really admired a lot of like music video directors. I was kind of all over the place, honestly.
Now, you had mentioned you did some internships. Could you kind of provide some more details on your career path, how you kind of got where you are now?
I actually did a documentary program for high schoolers when I was in high school. And that was the first time I ever tried making like a documentary. It was with the Sacramento Doc Foundation. Shout out to them. That was hugely formative. And then after that, I ended up going to film school for college to NYU, and which was also formative in a number of ways, not all of them even having to do with school. After that, beginning my freshman year, during the summer, I started doing internships every summer. And those were like, obviously, unpaid or minimum wage. So that was like, just sort of getting a little bit of experience to start to build a resume, so that then by the time I graduated, I was able to get assistant editing gigs. I did assistant editing for a while after graduation. And then what kind of started happening is like, I found that it was easier to make lateral moves rather than wait to be promoted like vertically within a company. So while I was doing assistant editing at various companies, I was also like by night doing editing work on the side so that I could build up a portfolio that suggested that I was an editor rather than an assistant editor, even though that's what I did all day, was assistant editing. And you kind of do enough of that, and like it sucks, to be clear. It's horrible to like go to work and do a full day of work and then come home and then do another day of work. But you do enough of that, and then suddenly like you do have a portfolio that you can show as an editor rather than an assistant editor. You can market yourself as such. And so I just did that. And then from the time that I got my first real editing gig, not assistant editing, it was kind of just off to the races. And now here I am.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I feel like that's something that nobody ever tells you. Is like you want to achieve something, you want to be at this certain level, but no one's just going to hand it to you. And it's almost like a catch-22. He's like, well, we can't hire you because you don't have enough experience, but you
Right.
can't get that experience without somebody hiring you. So.
Or if you have, for example, like an assistant editing job and you're really, really good at it, there's like really not a huge motivation to promote you to an editor because
Mm-hmm.
like you're doing so well at this job, like they'd be like, no, why would we get rid of you? Like you're doing incredibly, like we need you as an assistant. So you kind of like, yeah, I feel like you have to go rogue a little bit if you want to like
Definitely.
speed things up.
Definitely. All right. Now, you've worked on some different mediums, music videos, TV, shorts, but we'd like to focus specifically on your nonfiction work. Is that something you kind of sought out, or is it something that you just kind of fell into?
I think it's kind of one of those things where like work begets more work. You do one documentary project, you sign on to one documentary project and you do well at that, and then suddenly word of mouth is how you get like most of your work.
Mm.
And it's like, music doc specifically, it just became kind of like, oh, I just wrapped a music documentary, and then somebody's like, oh, I'm doing a music documentary, and they're like, oh, you should hire Camille, she just wrapped this music documentary. And like it just kind of happened. I don't know. I like blinked and it's like, yeah, I was like 4 music documentaries deep. That's great. But yeah, I think it was more of it more just happened than it being like a concerted thing that I was actively pursuing. But I love it.
Excellent. Yeah, I've spoken about this in other interviews. Like networking is such a huge component to the
Yes,
filmmaking industry. I mean, really, any industry, but specifically the filmmaking industry.
absolutely. Yeah. It's like, I mean, I do it myself. Like if I am booked on something and I get a request, like I have a whole list of editors that just go down. I'm like, I can recommend this person, I can recommend this person. And they do the same for me. So it's like, I don't know. Even though editors don't typically like see one another that often, because we're like off in
Hmm.
our respective caves all over. But you maintain a bit of a presence, so that people still know that you exist and that you're open to work. And yeah, if you're a cool person, work will follow.
Definitely. Yeah, that is one key is you want to be somebody that somebody wants to work with.
Yes, exactly. No, there are plenty of people who are just like total assholes. So
Now, moving on, we'd like to talk about your working process. Now, as far as pre-production goes, how early on are you brought onto a project? Do you have much of a role in pre-production?
it depends on the type of project. If we're talking like music video, for example, I'm typically brought on like, hello, are you available to start yesterday? Kind of a thing. Like it's very like we've already shot this thing, it was due yesterday, can you do it now? Like music video is
Mm.
very kind of slapdash. Projects like a narrative short, for example, I'm working on pre-production on 2 narrative shorts right now where I'm like not doing anything in pre-production, but the directors still want you to kind of like be involved, read the script, think to yourself like, how do I see this in the edit? Like, do I even see this being needed? Are there any scenes that like could be removed or reworked, before we go out and actually like spend time putting this thing together? With documentaries, in my experience, it has been more like we at least have a little bit shot, and now we're bringing you on and like we kind of have an idea of like where the story is going. But then every documentary I've ever worked on, they go back and shoot more footage. Like it's never just, oh, here's all the footage, now make a documentary. It spans like years. Typically there's something that I'm working from in a documentary and they bring me on only after they've totally wrapped pre-pro and like figured out what they're doing and have a festival in mind or something.
And when you're working on a documentary and there's archival footage, are you assembling that, during pre-production or like right before production to kind of inform the shoot, or so they can fill in the pieces, or how does that process go?
I don't think I've ever started a project that is just like exclusively archival to start with, and then they shoot something after, depending on what the archival dictates. That would be the case if you were working on a documentary that is super archival heavy. like if it's like relying on the archival very heavily. But in my experience, the projects that I've worked on have been more like archival is like peppered in there and like used to enhance moments, but isn't like the thing that the entire documentary is hinging on. It's more like verite moments and things that are happening in the present. So you would kind of, yeah, I feel like in the projects that I've worked on, the present day footage informs how we're going to use the archival, if that makes sense, rather than the other way around.
And could you walk us through your prep process for the Linda Perry project?
What had been shot at the beginning had already been ingested into a project. It was a Premiere Teams project, and it had been ingested by an AE, synced, organized. I think they had pulled selects for certain scenes, and other scenes the AE had actually put together like a rough like first pass of the scene, and then some scenes were just like they didn't exist at all yet. So my like prep, I guess, since I didn't have to physically prep the project itself, was going in, seeing what had been cut already, sort of polishing the cuts that did exist, making cuts out of selects that had been pulled, and then for the scenes that hadn't had any prep done to them, then it was just like watching a bunch of footage, and trying to kind of like wrap your head around what the footage could become and what the story was lying underneath all of it. And yeah. But in terms of actual physical prep, we had assistant editors on the project. So luckily I didn't have to be the one syncing and multicamming and all that stuff. But shout out to Dan.
Yeah, Dan, could you kind of go into a little bit of the details of the duties of an assistant editor?
Oh my gosh. Well, it varies from project to project, but for the Linda Perry project in particular, it was a matter of transcoding all the footage because I was working from proxies rather than the raw. Transcoding all of the footage, organizing it in the project, which they did a wonderful job of. I'm like really, really particular about how I like my folders organized, and they knocked it out of the park. And then you kind of just you sync all the footage, so you connect the external audio to the video so that there's sound. And if there are multiple cameras running at the same time, you sync together a multicam so that you have the A cam and the B cam stacked in the same setup, so I can switch between the two cameras and see what's happening at any given moment. He would pull selects, which is just going through all the footage and picking the best moments from whatever had happened in that. There might be 3 hours of uncut footage, but there's really only like an hour and a half of usable, like relevant stuff. So then I would take that hour and a half and cut it down to, a 4-minute scene or something. It's crazy how much footage you need to make. It's so condensed. But so yeah, he'd pull selects, and yeah, I mean, he was on a call. Oh, well, the one huge thing that the AE did. Oh my gosh, this was a huge thing. Okay, so I said that the project started in a Teams project, a Premiere Teams project. And then it became so bloated over time and so big as we worked on this thing for the course of multiple years, that it needed to be migrated to a PreProduction project. Wow. And the AE did that. And I do not know how, but he did. And it was amazing. He just like overnight, suddenly the project went from like local to cloud-based, and everybody could work on the project simultaneously. Everybody could be in it at the same time. And so that was a serious lift that the AE did. Yeah, just kind of, I would ask questions from time to time, like, do you remember seeing blah 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 scene when you were, transcoding the footage or whatever? And he'd be like, oh yeah, I think it's here, kind of a thing. So we had a good like back and forth, and he's very knowledgeable and easy to work with.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Now, next, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your work during production. When collaborating with a director, what do you look for? Are there any specifics as far as your working relationship goes?
I prefer to work with a director who provides their editor autonomy. There are certain directors that kind of see the editor as just like an extension of the computer. Like they know exactly what they want to do. They want to control every single thing that happens, and you're just the one that's operating the computer, rather than like a collaborative, creative group mind exercise. And so I really appreciate when a director sort of like lets me take a first pass at a scene by myself completely. Like, here's the footage, here's the general idea that I'm thinking, but I'm interested to see if you feel the same thing from this footage, if you're like thinking that this story is the one that makes the most sense. If you find something different, then like I would love to see your interpretation of it, because like ultimately the editor is a fresh set of eyes who is like effectively not involved in production at all. Like I don't know if you were like hanging backwards off a cliff to get that shot. And it's like really, really important that like you get the shot in the cut because like you almost died getting it. Like I don't care, like I wasn't there. Is it a good shot or is it not a good shot? And so it's important to just kind of like, I don't know. It's really nice when the director kind of like leaves you to your own devices for a little bit. You get your version of what you think the story should be out, and then it becomes a collaborative process where they come in and go, oh, well, like, I like this, or we're completely aligned here, or this is like, I don't agree, just, let's change it. But that's always a nice way to work, rather than just like from day one, them like coming and kind of breathing down your neck and telling you exactly what to do. I prefer a collaborative kind of environment.
Okay, excellent. Now, as far as the Dailies process, is it similar in documentaries as it is in narrative films, or is there a different kind of process there?
The process is the same. The only thing that I would think is like more different in documentary is just, or I mean, it's not to say that it doesn't happen in a narrative film too, but it's more common in documentary that you continue to get more dailies like throughout the entire course of the edit. Like with a narrative film, typically at some point, like you're done. Like you got all the footage, you have all of it, and like maybe they'll do a pickup here or there, and then you'll go through those dailies. But like with a documentary, I've found there's just always something coming in while you're working, and they're always shooting something else. I mean, particularly if you're working on a documentary that features a person who's alive, like the documentary mimics their life and their life is happening. So as time goes on, like more interesting things keep happening to them, and then you have to film it, and then it has to go into the edit. And so that's the main difference, I think, is just the constant nature of the documentary dailies as opposed to narrative. Like at a certain point, I think in narrative, you're kind of like, great.
As far as the communication goes, is there, a lot of communication as, say, you get dailies, and are you communicating with the director or somebody else that's actually on set to kind of, I need this to make the edit work or anything like that?
Happens all the time. All the time. Particularly in documentary, I feel like, because you'll discover as you're like halfway through an edit that you're trying to convey something that nobody actually ever said outright. That happens all the time with being like, okay, everyone's implying that like this is what's happening, this is the story, this is the progression, whatever, but like nobody actually said it, and so I often in documentary find myself having to ask the director to go do pickups to get like VO lines to help, or voiceover lines to kind of like help progress the story a little bit, to be like, hey, I know that this is what's supposed to be happening in this scene, but nobody in real life actually like introduced who this person was. Like nobody actually like acknowledges who this person is, like it's just assumed. So then we'll add, a little like, there could be a talking head moment or something where they go, this is, so-and-so came to my house the other day. That's just an example. But like to provide a little bit more context to the story, typically, yeah, you have to ask for pickups, because oftentimes when you're making, like, the documentary that you end up cutting is not always exactly the documentary that they set out to shoot. So you might find partway through the edit like, oh, okay, I know that like this is what you were shooting, but I think that this is actually the heart of the story, so now we need to go back and get more footage pertaining to this.
Okay.
Yeah, no, there's absolutely communication.
Excellent.
That's
Now
not to say that
speaking
it always gets like done. You can make
right.
this and they'll be like, okay, yeah, great, we'll try to get that. It doesn't always happen, but yeah.
Have you ever had those experiences where there was something that, say, you needed and or wanted, that didn't happen, and say it was something you needed and it just didn't get done? Was there's any instances where something like that happened, and how did you figure that out?
I had asked, we were trying to convey a concept in this. I'm working on a hip hop documentary right now. And we were trying to convey at one point, like, a sense of urgency and a sense of, like, now or never, and, like, this is my chance and I can't mess this up kind of a thing. But nobody was, and it's not to say that you have to say everything. I mean, show rather than tell always, but, like, we just weren't getting, like a singular line that like we really needed to kind of convey this idea that we were trying to convey. And we ended up, they even did a pickup shoot with the artist to try to get him to basically say this line that like we kind of, the whole scene was sort of hinging on. And it still didn't really happen even during the pickup. Like he said it in his own words, but it just like wasn't, it didn't have the impact that the rest of the scene was trying to have. And so we kind of ended up like switching it up and using other people's bites that they had said to kind of convey what he was thinking,
Okay.
but like have it be coming from other people that we had interviewed whose interviews like sort of could be applicable to his, and it worked to kind of like get outside perspective rather than having the thought come from the main character himself. But it was certainly a bit of Tetris for sure. We figured it out. And, you add like a dramatic music cue and you're good to go.
There you go. Now we always like asking that because a lot of our base is up and coming filmmakers, and I think it's important for them to know that not everything's going to go exactly how you plan it or how
Oh,
you want it. So being able to have that critical thinking to make it work, I think every filmmaker should have that.
oh yeah, you have to be able to pivot because not only will not everything go according to plan, like a lot won't go according to plan. Like the vast majority of things I feel won't go according to plan. So to the extent that you can like remain flexible, I think it will help you immensely.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, all editors, I think, can be considered writers because they're literally shaping the story. But I think maybe perhaps that's even more true in documentaries. How do you view yourself as a storyteller within a documentary world?
So the editor as a storyteller in the documentary world is sort of responsible for finding the story ultimately. I mean, like determining what exactly the story is that can be told, which hopefully is also, the director is also doing the same thing in tandem, or a story producer or whoever might be on board the project. But it's sort of step one is identifying what you think the story might be. Step two is conveying that story in a way that resonates best with viewers. Like to not only have it be a story, but also have it be a compelling story. Like there are a lot of really boring ways that you could tell an interesting story, and there are a lot of really interesting ways that you could tell a really boring story, and then it like suddenly becomes, like really cool depending on how you frame it. And it's kind of like it's sort of a matter of doing that, trying to make what you're trying to say as interesting and as digestible to a viewer as possible, while also remaining as objective as possible with a documentary specifically. Because it's just like you can tell when a documentary has like an impartial view on something. And the best documentaries I find are I mean, except for ones obviously where they're like talking about how bad global warming is or something. Like we all know. You don't need to be impartial for something like that.
Yeah.
Objectively bad, but it's, you know, like a portrait of a person or a portrait of a place, or like it's just to the extent that you can keep it just sort of objective and but still compelling to the viewer and let them kind of come to their own conclusions about the story, it's more powerful and it feels less like you're just being told what to feel. You're more like being guided what to feel, but not forced.
Okay. And speaking of objectivity, you know, I've done some editing myself, and like, you might edit a clip or a section of clips, you know, over and over and over again. Do you have any tips on maintaining objectivity when you're editing the same clips for weeks upon weeks?
Yes. Take breaks, definitely. If you can, if the timeline allows it, to jump around and do scenes not in chronological order, or you know, just in the order of the film, to kind of like hop around and jump into one scene and work on that and then come back to it, can really help provide some objectivity, because all the scenes have very different vibes typically, and you can kind of just get bogged down in one. And then if you go and try something new for a little bit and then come back to it, suddenly you might have like clarity that you gained from looking at other footage for a while. If all else fails, go to sleep. That's usually I'm like really, really at the end of my rope and I don't know what's going on anymore. Just go to sleep is usually what it means. But before that, your second to last line of defense is show your edit to somebody whose opinion you trust. Ideally, who doesn't know about what it is that you're working on, or you know, doesn't know like to the extent like the story, or you know, the whole thing, or what exactly that scene is supposed to be doing. Like if you can just show somebody blindly, like, this is a scene, what do you think of it? You know, that's super valuable if you trust their opinion. Because yeah, after a certain point, if you're working on a project, like, you're not objective anymore, the director's not objective anymore, like most of the people involved directly in the project are no longer objective. It's hard to look at something and like try to be watching it for the first time ever. So to show it to people where they're actually watching it for the first time ever, I think is the easiest way, honestly. And then also just like, if you show something to somebody, suddenly you kind of are able to see it a little bit more objectively just in showing it to someone. Like if you're sitting there watching them watch your cut, suddenly you're watching your cut back that you've watched 10,000 times, but you're watching them react to your cut and you're like, oh no, it sucks. Like, you can just like tell it kind of lets you see it with fresh eyes because you're imagining what a viewer is thinking while watching your cut. And so yeah, I think just introduce more people into the room rather than just like caving in on yourself.
Excellent. All right. All right. So jump around, bring in a fresh pair of eyes that you trust, yes. And if all else fails, sleep on it.
Go to sleep.
Got it. Now, you had mentioned before about how much footage it takes to make a film, especially documentaries. How much archival footage and footage that was already shot did you start with on the Linda Perry project?
Gosh, by the time when I came onto the project, I think they had already shot several months worth of footage.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they had been following her for quite a while, and then they kind of like determined what the story was that they were going to tell, and then, you know, the new footage sort of was informed by that. There was definitely more present day footage than there was archival. We didn't have like a lack of archival necessarily, but it's not an archival heavy documentary, and which also presented its own interesting issues and solutions. I mean, by the time we were done with the documentary, there was like 2 years worth of footage, you know.
Wow.
It was a lot, which is why we had to migrate the project. It just kept growing and growing. But and then we determined that for any gaps that we had where we would have preferred there to have been archival that like didn't exist, you know, memory that Linda had, or a story that she's telling where we don't have any footage to support it, then we added in claymation animation.
Oh, wow.
Which was really cool, and was one of our executive producers' ideas. And we were like, "What?" Like when he suggested it, we were like, because there's typically not really animation in documentaries,
Mhm.
but it was a brilliant suggestion, and it worked so well because we did just have this, like, a few serious gaps in the footage, um, and like Linda was one of like a bunch of kids, and so even like we didn't have like tons of photos of her as a kid, like as you get like deeper in the number of kids, like there are just fewer and fewer pictures of you, like there's 1,000 pictures of the firstborn kid, and then by the like
Yeah.
there's like no photos. We just like didn't have a ton of like past stuff to work with, and so the claymation worked beautifully, and it worked beautifully not only to convey memories and things that had happened that we didn't have the footage to support, but also just sort of like concepts that you can't show, like just like the idea of like fear in your mind,
Mm.
or like shame, or just stuff like that it can't really, like, you don't have like, let me show you a picture of fear. It's just, you can't. So the claymation really helped kind of like create this vibe, um, that we would not have been able to achieve just from regular like normal footage alone. So yeah, that
That's
was,
amazing. Yeah,
yeah.
I feel like that's another way of critical thinking. If there is a specific story that Linda might have told that you just really wanted to tell, but you didn't have the footage, I think I was watching a documentary the other night, and they actually had an animated bit to it as well, and I was like, wow, that's very interesting. And I started thinking about it. It's like, well, maybe this is a story that they wanted to tell, but they just didn't have the actual footage of it happening. And
Yeah,
rather than reenactments, which can be a little iffy in my
yeah, they're hit and
opinion.
miss.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, animation, you kind of had full control over however you want it to be, portrayed. So that's
Hmm.
amazing.
No, it was very, very cool. And yeah, I mean, the alternative is just to like have them tell the story in a talking head
Mm.
confessional interview setting, which is like so boring. You don't want to just watch somebody speak for 5 minutes. So yeah, it was huge. I feel like it's sort of like the cornerstone of the documentary now at this point.
That's amazing. Now, how would you say your background in music videos has informed your work in documentaries?
So a lot of the documentaries that I have edited have been music documentaries. So, and that's not to say that that makes them similar to a music video in most ways, but I mean, there's obviously a music component. But all editing has kind of like inherent rhythm, regardless of whether there's music present or not. But especially things that do incorporate music. Um, and I think, I mean, basically every scene will, like, I'll use the Linda Perry film as an example. Any scene where she's performing in the documentary, I cut essentially like a live video, music video. You've got multiple cameras of the performance happening, and you're flexing exactly the same muscles as in a music video. Um, the only difference being typically that well, at least in our film, we didn't usually show like the entire length of a song being played, because that's kind of like a little much to ask the audience to just like sit there for 4 minutes, and like music video break in the middle of a documentary. So it was sort of like a consolidated, like you're kind of stitching different parts of the song together to make it seem like, it's a full song, but it's really only playing for like 30 seconds. Um, but totally, totally same muscles, a live video and a live performance in a documentary. Um, and then plenty of documentary editing incorporates like stylistic elements. Even if it's rooted in reality, you can still use like some really fun like choppy editing or stuff to
Mm.
kind of just like spice it up and not make it so just like sitting and watching somebody talk. And so yeah, utilize tons of techniques that I would typically use in editing music videos for documentaries instead. They're like fairly interchangeable. You just have to know when to use them.
Now, earlier you had mentioned how to maintain, contact and relationships with other editors. How do you go about maintaining that contact? Is it just social media? Do you call each other on the phone? It's like, hey, can you take a look at this edit?
Well, I'm married to an editor.
Oh, okay.
So he's the one that I make watch things in person. Like he's watched, that poor man has watched every edit I've ever done. But then beyond that, outside of like that's like the in-person viewing that I typically get, but and then beyond that, it's really just it's social media. I know they have like editor meetups and stuff, but I don't typically go because I'm a hermit. Like just the job description, like the idea of going to a meetup where everybody there is like me and like doesn't want to talk to people is just like I don't know. But yeah, no, it's just like keeping tabs on what your editor acquaintances are working on and going to premieres and getting viewing links if they have a film that's gone live and just like yeah, I think social media is like primarily how I keep in contact with people at this point, and then I make my real life editor husband watch my edits in person.
Okay, all right. What advice would you give someone who is about to edit a documentary?
There are two things. One we kind of touched on, which is that I would try to maintain as much flexibility as possible if you're working on a documentary or setting out to work on a documentary, because it's going to change. Like, I mean, a narrative film will change. Like, if you write a script and then you shoot something, like, it's going to end up being slightly different than whatever you planned. But, like, a documentary will end up probably more likely than not being vastly different than what you planned. Just try to not stay super rigid, be open to new ideas, because sometimes something new that you add at the very end will just like completely recontextualize the entire thing, and then you have to kind of go back and reevaluate existing scenes now that you have this new one, and like it's totally shifting around all the time, the edit and like the themes and the story just constantly moving and changing shape. So you kind of need to you can't get too locked in on one moment or one idea. I would say kind of in the same line of thinking, but just like don't overthink things too much. I find my best scenes are always ones that like didn't require a ton of work. Like there are certain scenes that you just like are like editing and re-editing and re-editing and like this doesn't feel right and like I can't get this to work, and you're just like showing it to a million people and like what's wrong with it, and you're just like it's getting kind of overwrought. And those scenes to me always just end up feeling, I mean, a little bit strained. And the ones that just kind of flow effortlessly and like I guess my bit of advice would be, this is my bit of advice. it's if you do something the first time, like if you put together an edit for the first time, let's say, and it works, like don't second guess it. It's like if it happened that easily and it's just like bleh, and you like spit out like what feels to you like a perfect edit, it's perfect. Like don't touch it. Don't like go back in and pick everything apart and like just leave it, because odds are if it felt that like viscerally good to begin with, then you're only going to tear it apart. You're not going to make it better just by like overworking it. The last scene in the Linda Perry film, which is my favorite scene in the entire movie, it has remained basically unchanged since my rough cut of the scene. Like it has essentially not changed for a year, and that's the one that ended up going live just because I spat it out onto the timeline and it worked, and I showed it to the director and he was like, "This works," and like truly, if it's not broke, like don't try to fix it. If it works, it works. Don't overthink it.
So, Camille, are there any films or editors that kind of inspired you to become a documentary filmmaker?
There are films that I have found particularly inspiring when just sort of crafting my own edits and crafting my own stories. And I find that most of them are ones where they let the story sing through the verite moments rather than talking heads. Like Minding the Gap, I thought was a brilliant documentary. There are talking head moments in that, obviously, and confessional interview type things, but they really just kind of like, the documentary just goes. Like the story happens and then it evolves as it's happening. And it almost feels as though the director is sort of like realizing what the story is as we're watching it unfold. I just thought it was like a really, really brilliant structure. Same deal with like, I mean, if we're talking music documentaries, Metallica, Some Kind of Monster, is that one's a trip. It's very verite heavy, and it's very much just like watching a band crumble in real time, And I feel like that's just so effective because it's like it's just the epitome of show don't tell, which is really what you should be chasing as much as possible with documentary editing and storytelling in general. I know that our director for the film, Linda Perry, was really inspired by American Symphony for one reason specifically, and it was that I still need to watch it, but he told me that he watched it and that there were no lower thirds in the film, which is like, when you like I'm sitting here and it would say down here, like Camille Getz, or whatever. So there were no lower thirds in the film, which again, like maybe don't quote me on that because he might have been wrong, but he like called me on the phone to be like, I just watched American Symphony and there were no lower thirds in the film. And it was just like, it was like the anti-documentary. Like it just happened. Like you either figure out who the person is that's talking or you don't, and sort of like the verite scenes like informed who the people were that were talking and stuff. And he was super, super stoked on that, which I found really interesting. And then we kind of tried to apply that same, I mean, obviously we still have lower thirds in the Linda Perry movie, but like that same line of thinking that's sort of like removing things rather than adding things, like affording the viewer a little bit of autonomy to kind of like trust them that they're going to figure out what the story is without like hammering them over the head with it. And so, yeah,
Excellent.
I mean, now that I say that, I should probably go and watch the movie and make sure that this all what's up. But I just remember him calling me and being like, this is huge. I saw this new technique that really blew my mind.
Okay, excellent. And lastly, do you have any advice for, editors who are just getting started in their careers? Maybe something that you would have said to yourself when you were just starting.
I'm sure there's like a bunch of advice that I could give that's more like holistic, just in terms of like how you should, the trajectory of your life and whatever. But I think the best piece of advice, honestly, that I have that's like literal, like I'm making my first documentary, we're talking like production and like editing type advice, would honestly be to not rely too much on talking heads in your documentary. If you're making a documentary, I would really focus on verite moments and just like letting the story breathe in real life rather than sitting people down in a chair and having them just like talk and constantly be cutting to different people's heads and stuff. It's much more compelling and effective to watch a story unfold in a verite moment than it is to like essentially write a movie or like script a documentary using talking heads. And I think that the tendency is to rely really heavily on that when you first start editing a documentary, but to the extent that you can kind of like let it breathe a little bit and let it live on its own without trying to shape it too much, it'll be stronger for it.
Excellent. Well, Camille, we made it to the end. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. For more interviews or deep dives into the StudioBinder software, like and subscribe to be notified when new videos are added. I'm Brandon with StudioBinder Academy. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.